Hello, everyone. Welcome to our podcast on competition law in digital markets in Latin America by the Center for Entertainment, Technology and Information Law, CENTI. We are here today to discuss the key issues, relevant topics, and the proposed solutions by experts on competition and innovation policy in Latin America. The purpose of this project is to open the debate in society and policy making regarding how to approach regulation and enforcement in digital markets. To lead this discussion, we have invited some of the most experienced professionals in competition, technology, and innovation to help us lead this debate. Today, we are glad to be having Dr. Schrepel to join us in a discussion regarding competition law and innovation policy, focusing on ex-ante regulation and artificial intelligence. Welcome, Dr. Schrepel.
Thank you very much.
Dr. Schrepel is an associate professor of law at Rijns University in Amsterdam, and he is a faculty affiliate at Stanford University, where he founded the Computational Antitrust Project that brings together over 65 antitrust agencies. He holds research and teaching positions at the University of Paris I and Paris II. He is a member of the scientific board of the French Regulatory Authority for Audiovisual and Digital Communication. He is a blockchain expert appointed by the World Economic Forum, and recently he has focused his research on blockchain antitrust, computational antitrust, and complexity science. Today, we would like to begin this discussion by asking you, what are your main ideas regarding Digital Markets Act, and how should Latin America see this enforcement and this regulation initiative in other jurisdictions?
Yeah, of course. So I think, first of all, what's very important to keep in mind is that the DMA is European-centric, made by EU institutions for the EU market, right? And I'm about to explain why that is. But it's, I think, not a good idea to take the DMA and to try to transplant the DMA such as it is in other countries, right? I talked to agencies in Asia, it wouldn't work. In Latin America, it wouldn't work. In the United States, I'm not saying it should never be the case that the DMA will inspire other policymakers and agencies, but to take it such as it is wouldn't be a good idea. Now, the reason for that is because, again, if you look at EU markets, you see that there are some specificities that you may not encounter in other regions of the world, starting with the concept of a gatekeeper, and that is very specific to the EU. So the basic idea is that the DMA only applies to the companies or the services within those companies that are being called core platform services, right? So here you look at 10 different types of core platform service. It could be social media, video sharing platform, operating system, and so on and so forth. Already, what's very interesting with the DMA is that although it was only passed just a couple of months ago, within those 10 sectors, there is one that is missing, and that is the one of generative AI, right? So OpenAI and other related companies won't be covered by the DMA, which already tells you something about the fact that the DMA is very rigid and cannot easily be adapted to what's unfolding, right? Now, what's also quite puzzling is that within each of those core platform service, so let me take digital advertisement as an example, you not only have one gatekeeper as you would expect, but in fact you have several gatekeepers, which means that we should probably call them gatekeepers, right? Which kind of already, at the very least, is suspicious. So for ads, online advertisements, you do indeed have Google, Amazon, and Meta, which, again, if you look at the concept of a gatekeeper here, and that's very specific to the EU market, the idea behind is that if you want to advertise online and impact the EU market, you will have no choice but to go through the gate of one company. But in fact, here, EU institutions are telling us, well, you have at least 3 options. And for social media, you have 4 options. For intermediation, you have 6 options. So you see that this is maybe something you do not want to reproduce, right? And the basic idea of the DMA is that once you have labeled those gatekeepers, the DMA only apply to those companies and to some degree won't be adaptable, right? So we have a list of do's and don'ts, but long story short, this is a list of practices that companies cannot implement, supposedly based on EU experience. So once again, this is why this is very, very EU-centric. The idea behind, which appears in the first recitals of the DMA, would be to say, well, we have a lot of experience with certain practices, and instead of going to court every single time, we're just going to prohibit those practices because we know they are bad. But if you look at the pretty much 30 practices that are prohibited within the DMA, actually a bit over 10 of those practices went before the EU courts, right? So you can make a point that for those 10, if indeed they are always bad, why not prohibit those practices? But I will come up with examples showing that sometimes they can be good. But for 20 other of those practices, they've never been to EU court. So here, looking at that from Latin America, you may want to ask yourself, do we have court cases? And if so, is it the case that the practice was always deemed to be bad without even having a discussion about the economic effect of those practices? And if you've been teaching competition law or practicing competition law or enforcing competition law, you may have come up to try with examples of practices that are always bad, and I believe they don't exist, right? I can make a point that even a cartel, although it sounds like kind of the worst practice you can implement, within some circumstances could actually be okay, right? What if there is a war, a pandemic? So this is why, again, you have to look at that from the perspective of what it is, meaning a text designed for the EU based on EU experience, and which already you could say is showing its limits when it comes to adaptability, flexibility, and the ability to indeed better match with what we have out there, meaning those digital markets.
Thank you very much. I think those are concerns that should be addressed by agencies, by policymakers, but also by academics, because when we approach these subjects, they're quite fascinating. And taking into account one of the topics you mentioned, I would like to hear your thoughts about artificial intelligence and competition law, talking about what you referred at the beginning of your last intervention, and what is artificial intelligence, how its dynamics, what are we talking about when we're talking about artificial intelligence, and what will be its impact on competition law?
Yeah, so let me take one example, and I will come back to the DMA to try to make sense of all that. You may know of a company that still exists, but is kind of dead, called Blockbuster. If you've never seen this company, I'm sure you had equivalent in Latin America. This was all over the place. Basically, the idea is that you will be able to go to one of the stores of that company and rent a DVD, right? Something people used to do, let's say, 15, 20 years. I remember that being a kid, this was very exciting. Anyway, long story short, if you wanted to go to that store and rent a DVD, you of course had to pay, right? I forgot the price, but let's say €1 to rent a DVD, or 2, 3, the equivalents, whatever the currency might be. But 90% of the turnover of the company wasn't made by renting you the DVDs and the price of the renting service, but it was made by what Blockbuster used to call the late fees, meaning when you were given the DVD, you had 2, 3, 4, 5 days to watch the movie and then return the movie. And if you were late returning the movie, you could keep the DVD at your place, but then you had to pay on a daily basis those late fees, right? So let's say a penalty of €1. And again, this represented 90% of the turnover of that company. Suddenly arrives another company called Netflix. And what some of you may not know is that Netflix did not start doing streaming online services. Netflix started actually as a service where you could subscribe for you to have a certain amount of DVD at your place. So typically you could, let's say, subscribe to have 3 DVDs at your place. You will go on Netflix, the website, you will list all the DVDs, all the movies you wanted to watch. Netflix will send you those 3 DVDs. You will have, and like a big list, let's say. And if you were returning those DVDs to Netflix, then they will send you the movies that appears, let's say, 4th or 5th on the list, right? And Netflix said to you, if you don't want to return the DVDs, no problem. You won't pay any late fees. but you simply won't receive the DVD that appears next on your list. And Blockbuster, faced with that issue, had a choice to cannibalize its own business model, right? So to kill the way by which the company was making money, meaning to kill the late fees, or not to do it. And long story short, Blockbuster decided not to do it, so to keep the late fees, and the company kind of disappeared, right? I think you only have one store remaining in the United States. Now, the reason why I'm telling you all that is because generative AI, so the idea here is to use AI to be able to generate content. It could be text, it could be audio, video, and so on and so forth. I think is putting a lot of what we may call the incumbents in a similar situation to the one Blockbuster experienced. Let me give you a concrete example. Let's say you are the owner of a small business and you want to create your own website to attract customers, and you need to have a nice, beautiful picture of, let's say, Latin America, or let's be even more specific, let's say the city of Lima, to put on the front page of your website. You really have two options at this stage. You could go to one of those banks where you will actually find a picture that kind of corresponds to what you're looking for and pay the equivalent in euro of 500 euros for you to have the right to use the picture. Or you could go to one of those generative AI websites. I can name a few. ChatGPT is one, Google Bard, Anthropic, Midjourney, and so on and so forth, and actually prompt the system to generate a picture that corresponds precisely to what you want, right? So it could be the city of Lima, it could be a couple there, it could be even more specific than that, and get the picture for free. So long story short, if you are a website providing people with those banks of images, now you are in the Blockbuster situation in which you can basically try to kill your business model and develop your own generative AI alternative. Or if you're not doing it, well, most likely you will disappear. And that is true for Google as well, because that business model of the 10 blue links, whenever you actually ask something on the Google website, I would argue is kind of dead, because the equivalent is that you can use any of those websites to prompt the answer. Here you receive only one answer, which is very specific to what you are looking for. So you see that when we talk about AI, we talk about dynamic competition and something that will reshape markets. Now, once you've said all that, the role for the policymakers, and especially I would say for enforcement agencies, is to make sure that the system can develop as it should, mainly meaning here fairly without anti-competitive practices being implemented, right? And so you really have two options for that, because again, if the AI ecosystem is then crippled with those practices, then the story I just gave you will never happen. Option number one, you go for regulation. So the DMA would have been an option. As I mentioned already, the DMA is not covering generative AI, but you could say, well, because we are actually now in 2023 or 2024 or 2025, well, we're going to create the equivalent to the DMA and we're going to include generative AI. The problem I will have with that, and the reason why you should be careful if that's your intention, is that one, this kind of ex-ante regulation cannot adapt, right? So if they prove to be ineffective, it's hard for you to then go back to Congress or to your parliament or whatever the process is and to say, let's vote to another version of that text, even to revise. It usually takes a lot of effort. Two, if on top of being ineffective, they prove to be effective and actually to create negative effects on the market, then you are facing the same issue. You cannot adapt your DMA, right? Or your equivalent. So to give an example, in the DMA is prohibited the fact of self-preferencing your product and services, meaning that if you, let's say, run a social media and want to develop a search engine, then you cannot self-preference, meaning you cannot put your search engine at the top of your social media, or vice versa. I understand the logic behind, but what you may find is that, in a sense, what you are doing by preventing self-preferencing is that you are preventing big tech companies from leveraging what they have already in order to enter another market where another big tech companies may be operating, right? So in a sense, you are protecting each of the big tech companies' own market. You are saying to Google, no worries, Facebook won't be able to sell preferences they do search. You are saying to Facebook, no worries, Google won't be able to sell preferences they've introduced in your social media, and so on and so forth. So transplant it now to AI. Well, you see already how this kind of provisions that you may always want to enforce in the same way may be good sometimes, some other times they may actually frozen competition. And I'm not sure this is what you want within your AI ecosystem, because again, if that is frozen, it means that it won't compete nicely with everything that is non-AI related, right? So to make it more specific, as I explained, regulation may not be the best way, or at least it may be way too soon for you to pursue if you want to be effective and have positive effect on the market. What I would say, on the contrary, is that enforcement actions may be appropriate already in 2024. And here, most specifically, I think what should be targeted are the practices implemented within the AI ecosystem that are actually freezing the markets. Because again, that's what you want to avoid at all costs. And that begs the question as to which kind of practices within AI would indeed freeze the market, and which kind of practices will be, not okay, but maybe not the top priority. And for you to answer that question, you have to ask yourself the question, what is the source of the growth within the AI ecosystem? And here you could look at different variables. So I will go through maybe 2 or 3 of them. It could be, you could suspect that data is the source of it. Actually, I think it is not. Of course, if you don't have any data, you cannot develop an AI system and, train your foundation models and put a generative AI on top of it. That is true. But we see now that there are generative AI systems that can compete with much bigger models and actually provide a quality that is almost as good, if not as good or better, right? So data is nice, but this is not what will define competition. Then you could look at talent. Some agencies have expressed the desire to investigate the no-poach agreement, non-compete. Why not? But actually, I could direct you to many universities in Latin America, in the United States, in Europe, in Asia, in Africa, where you will find a lot of talents willing and actually in a position to develop nice AI system, right? So this is nice to have. Without talent, no companies, 100%, but this is not what will define whether or not you will win the market. I think what is key here for those companies to grow and survive is access to users. Why is that? Because first, you can learn from what users are doing with your system, which is highly valuable because it means you can fine-tune the system and make sure that it better answers what people are looking for. And 2, if you have users, it means you generate profits, or at least you have a turnover. If you have that, it means you can pay to get access to unique data sets, which is very valuable. If you have that, it means you can actually cover the cost to compute. So the cost for everyone to use the system, they are very high when it comes to OpenAI. To give you an order of magnitude, on a daily basis, the company reportedly spends $700,000, right? Without users, you will not generate any turnover. You won't be able to cover those costs. So access to user is key, and I will finish there. This means to be very specific for competition agencies that what you may want to do is to enforce competition law against the practices implemented by one company that is eliminating access to users for other companies. So you go back through the list of all the practices you've enforced in your competition law regime, let's say in the last 20 years, and ask yourself this question, is it the kind of practice that may actually deprive access to users? If you want to do categories out of that, if you look at prices, the answer generally will be negative. So I'm not saying this is not interesting, but maybe you should not, target prices within that ecosystem that is very dynamic. If you look at practices affecting existing users, I'm not saying there is no harm, but it shouldn't be the top priority for you. However, new practices where actually for a company down the line will be absolutely preventing that company from accessing the user would mean the end of that company, would mean that the ecosystem will be frozen, and that the nice story that I gave you with the blockbuster of this world will never happen. So I hope I answers your question. To sum up, regulation, maybe one day, but first, it may be ineffective. Second of all, it's hard to adapt. And when you are trying to regulate the systems that on a daily basis, if not on a hourly basis, is actually changing a lot, enforcement may be best. But when it comes to enforcement, it doesn't mean, of course, you have to have priority. It doesn't mean you can enforce everything at once. And I think the priority should be practices freezing the ecosystem, because this is what you want to avoid.
Thank you very much, Dr. Schrepel. That was very interesting to hear your thoughts, and specifically regarding a proposed agenda of priorities that should be addressed given the new dynamics that these markets are leading. I will just ask you to sum up or give your final remarks regarding our topics today before we say bye to an audience for our first section.
Yeah, of course. So maybe one final word, and I will take this opportunity to maybe try out a new idea, something I did not discuss. We talked about companies using AI, companies being dynamic, and I gave the impression that the policymakers, they are stuck in a world where they have to be static. This is true to some extent, but it doesn't have to be that way, especially when it comes to the enforcers. Competition agencies can also use AI. And when I talk about using AI, to be more specific, those enforcers, they can actually use AI to better understand their own case law, what they've been doing, take a step back, maybe redirect, change policies. 2, they can use AI to better detect practices, right? You may be able to screen billions of data entries at once, do some analysis using web scraping, maybe better understand the effect of mergers on the market. 3, you may be able to use AI to better analyze the practices that you think might be anti-competitive. Just looking at merger control, why not using machine learning based on your past experience enforcing merger control, and then being able to observe what happened after your decision on the market to try to better shape the way you do merger control? This is definitely possible. 4, you may use AI to better enforce the law, right? So to better monitor the effects of your enforcement actions, the behaviors of the companies, to maybe shorten the remedies, extend the remedies, make them stricter, and so on and so forth. And 5th, you may want to use AI to also help the companies, right? Of course, not every single company is in the business of infringing antitrust. For the large majority, this is not what they want to do. So if you provide them with the tools to better understand competition law, this is something that most companies will welcome. And here I'm talking about making decision trees, interactive interface, develop your own little generative AI where companies could go and prompt the system and ask questions, is that okay, not okay, and so on and so forth. So as a policymaker, I would say be interested in those issues, but also be aware that you can use AI. And I know that in Latin America, many agencies are now starting to indeed hire data, computer scientists, and understand what they can do with it. For the parliament out there listening to us, please give them the budget so that they can do more of that, as opposed to going ex ante with a list of practices and write something in marble that will never change. I would say this will be a better use of your resources.
Thank you very much, Dr. Schrepel, for your input today, for all your thoughts. I think this leaves us with a lot of room for discussion, a lot of things to think about, and a lot of opportunities for companies, for enforcement agencies, for policymakers, and specifically from the compliance perspective that is becoming much more important as an alternative to traditional regulation or enforcement. So thank you very much for joining us today, and we'll hope to see you again here in our podcast.
Thanks very much.